to the podcast Will Act for Change. I am your host, Kat Kemet. This podcast is where we explore the relationship between theater and film arts and advocacy. Today, I'm joined by Bill Fitzhugh, award-winning novelist, playwright, and screenwriter. Bill hails from Jackson, Mississippi, where he worked at the University of Southern Mississippi as a program director, music director, and DJ. After moving to Seattle to attend the University of Washington, he worked as a comedic radio program host with Matt Hansen that they later produced as a TV pilot called Stellavision. Bill has been living and working in Los Angeles since 1988, working simultaneously as a TV writer and paralegal. And in 2008, his novel, Pest Control, which he adapted from a screenplay he'd written, was produced for the stage. I first met Bill at the group rep at the Lonnie Chapman Theater in North Hollywood. It was there I saw a musical adaptation of his novel, A Perfect Harvest. The lighthearted musical theater romp, titled The Altruist, follows the story of a terminally ill patient that decides to become the ultimate altruist by donating all of his organs while he's still alive. While the musical is fun, high energy, upbeat, the subject matter contrasts with heavy themes of bodily autonomy, end-of-life care, and the bureaucracy surrounding medicine, organ donation, and physician-assisted suicide. Bill's satirical take on this dark subject matter is informed, well-researched, and in spite of it all, endlessly funny. Bill, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Kat.
Now, Bill, my first question for you is, when and why did you first decide to start writing satire?
Early on, in high school, there was a program, I don't know if they still have it, called Junior Achievement. They still have that? Okay.
They still do, yeah.
So they came to my high school, and one of the companies that sponsored one of the JA companies, was the Lamar Life Insurance Company, which happened to own television and radio station licenses. And they had the big AM top 40 radio WJDX, as well as the big FM rock radio station WZZQ. And so I signed up for that because, I mean, we all listened to ZZQ. It was a rock station long before classic rock happened. I mean, it was what evolves into classic rock. And so some older guys, I was maybe a sophomore, junior, some older people from a different high school were part of the company, and they decided they wanted to do a political interview program. And so this is going to run this is part of public service requirements for a license. And so they're going to run these shows at 7 o'clock in the morning on Sunday when nobody's listening. And they did one interview with some local politicians, and it was just some dumb high school kids asking softball questions, and the guy being a politician. And it was terrible. It was nice, like nobody wants to, even if anyone's listening, they don't want to hear this.
Right.
So I staged a coup. And some friends of mine and I voted these guys out of office, and said we're going to do a show about rock and roll, about the artists that everybody listens to on the station. So I was the writer and the narrator and produced. Well, I learned production from one of the guys at the radio station who was our mentor. But so the shows were straightforward histories of bands interspersed with music from the bands. But there were also, so part of the thing was you had to have somebody, oh, there's my new puppy. In addition to writing and producing programs, the idea of Junior Achievement is it's a company. So somebody has to go sell ads because that's how radio works. Right. So we had an ad for the local Coca-Cola distributor or somebody. And instead of just taking one of their pre-produced commercials, I decided I would write one. And it was a spoof of Genesis, not the band, but the Bible Genesis. and there was chaos and void, and then God created Coca-Cola, and then and then it was a Dr. Pepper commercial, and we had the music from Jesus Christ Superstar in the background, but I was just playing on the familiarity with the words of Genesis, but I turned it into a Dr. Pepper commercial,
Right.
and it was terrible, but that was, but it was, I was, I like to make fun of stuff. And religion is one of my favorite targets. And so that was probably one of the first things. That was probably one of the very first things. And then it just, I don't do, so since then I've done a whole bunch of different comedy forms, radio stuff that was kind of like the National Lampoon Radio Hour, where you make, you do phony commercials and you do phony game shows and stuff like that. So we turned the radio show into a television pilot, and everything's got some satire in it. Some of it's just goofy character stuff.
Right.
And then wanted to get some sort of sketch comedy writing thing going. Actually, this was so long ago that I called, my writing partner and I called Saturday Night Live's offices and asked for Al Franken, and he answered the phone.
Gosh.
And we say, hey, Al, we got this radio show out in Seattle. Again, we send you some tapes, and maybe you can, think about us. And he did. And he said, well, it's pretty funny stuff, but you got to live in New York. It's like, not moving. Yeah. Can't we just send it in? No. So anyway, just spent, everything I've written is I'm trying to be funny. I'm usually trying to make fun of something in the course of telling the story.
Right.
Entertainment Weekly reviewed one of my books and just said, he doesn't write mysteries so much as he writes social lampoons. And I thought, well, that's close. So
that was actually something that I thought was pretty interesting watching The Altruist, is that it was hilarious, but it didn't really feel like you were making fun of what would be, I guess, the victims in the scenario, the organ donors themselves, the physicians. You struck an interesting balance of the people who were on the chopping block were people associated with the bureaucracy of it. How did you strike that balance in the comedy of The Altruist?
Well, there's nothing, I don't think it's would be sort of punching down to make fun of somebody who's dying and needs a liver or whatever.
Right.
And it's, and I'm not sure that it's frequently it's about the circumstance. I take, a lot of my books are normal people in abnormal situations.
Right.
Most people aren't on the waiting list for an organ. It's an abnormal situation. So, okay, that's interesting. But the fact that the bureaucracy leaves so many people to die, I mean, that's not the plan, but that's the result of how they've developed this thing. And so that's, to me, that's worth exploring. And I'll always, you could write a very serious play about this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't, but somebody could, very dramatic and, but I'm not that, I can't do it. Not that I don't want to. I've tried to write a serious thriller, and it was terrible, just because I kept thinking, oh, this would be funny. What if,
yeah.
But the genesis of this particular story is long and convoluted, and it goes back to when I wrote my second novel, which is called The Organ Grinders, which was the first transplant book, which is about xenografting, which is the biotech industry trying to find ways to transplant animal organs into people. And since I wrote that, I mean, as recently as a few months ago, they've transplanted a couple of transgenic pig hearts into patients who were going to die. And
Right.
they knew that even with the transgenic heart, they weren't going to live, but they wanted to see how far along they'd come in terms of solving the rejection problem, which is the whole problem with transplants. The connecting the parts is easy. It's the body's rejection that's got to be overcome.
Yeah.
So anyway, I wrote the Organ Grinders, and I happened to know a playwright by the name of Leonard Gersh, who wrote a very famous play that was turned into a movie called Butterflies Are Free. And anyway, so Leonard read Organ Grinders and sent me this very funny email about, oh, we should turn this into a musical. And he wrote a few lines of lyrics, some of which are in the Altruist. And I kept saying those lyrics over and over, and I finally heard, you could sing. I don't know if he wrote it to this melody, but you could sing it to the caissons go marching along. So I just got that and fleshed it out into a full song. So anyway, but I thought, well, when he sent me the email, that's a funny idea. We got all these transgenic baboons doing dance numbers and so forth. But I don't know how to write a play. I'm not interested, and I just filed that away. And then some years later, there's a story about a guy in Georgia who was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, and he said, I've got a better idea. Let's just take all my organs, save 8 people. I don't have to die that way. I thought, that's a great story. It's very dramatic, and I don't know how to make it funny. So I filed that away. And then California passed the AB 15 some years ago, which is a right to physician-assisted death for terminal patients. And the way ideas work, light bulb,
Right.
Those 2 things came together and said, oh, this is perfect. This guy's in the same circumstance as the guy in Georgia. He sees that he can, get a way out by taking advantage of AB 15. But then the idea of the organ donation comes up, and there's conflict. Yay. So we can fight this in court. We can do this. And then this producer shows up, want to turn it into a musical. It's like,
Right.
Now I've made it funny. So
well, I thought it was very interesting how much information was included in the Altruist. There were things that I learned actually through watching the play. And when I was looking up your personal background for the podcast, I realized you were a paralegal at one point. How did that factor into the research, and especially did you dive into any of the legal jargon surrounding the bill California passed, or any of that while writing?
Yeah, the paralegal job was just a day job, while we try to make get into the industry, right? And it actually is much. It was very helpful for learning how to edit, because I was summarizing depositions. That was almost, other than doing some document production culling, the main thing I did was summarize depositions, which is to say, you get this 400-page deposition and you try to get it down to 70 pages so the lawyers, know where to look for the right information. And sometimes, because of the format, you'd have a block of text that would split a page, and it's like, I've wasted half a page. I've got to find something I can cut out of that to make it fit back on that page. And you just find all this stuff that doesn't add anything. Take that out. So anyway, there wasn't a lot of research there. The research came when I started writing novels as opposed to screenplays, where you should do some research before you write a screenplay if it's about something you don't know. But you can't really stick it in very much. That's, you can't write a bunch of factual stuff about insects in a screenplay without it coming across as bad exposition. But in a novel, you can put more of that stuff in there. So with pest control, I did an enormous amount of research on insects, and I stuck way too much of it in the book, but it had its own little charm. But then going forward with like the organ grinders, there was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle about a guy who had HIV who wanted to get a baboon bone marrow transplant. So this is back in 98 or 99, so a long time ago. But he wanted to get a baboon bone marrow transplant to see if that would, help with the HIV. And everybody was up in an uproar about, this is, and that's where I came across the word xenografting. And everybody was, it could, release all these new pathogens in humans if you do this. And anyway, he finally got permission to have the thing done. It didn't help, and he subsequently passed away. But all the research into the biomedical aspects of this, both the science part as well as the financial part, was fascinating. And so I became a really big researcher, and so it informs. You can't just write all of your research. That's dull. So you've got to have characters who bring that into the story.
Right.
In doing The Altruist, by that point I'd already written 3 novels about transplants. And so I have files. I have 10 linear feet of documents about organ transplants and crazy stories, the people selling their kidneys in India and all this stuff. So I can just, and I've got a lot of it in my head. And so writing the story was easier because I know enough about it now to pique people's interest.
Right. What was one of the most interesting, or some of the most interesting things you learned during that research process?
God, there's just a million things. It's like I ran into a problem in the novel Heart Seizure, which is a woman has worked her way up to the top of the transplant list for hearts, but she has AB negative blood. So that's very rare. And blood types matter with heart transplants, especially. And then the president, who also happens to have AB negative blood, has a fainting spell, which, we know, the reader knows, no, he had a heart attack. He needs a transplant. And
yeah. So
they go to steal the heart that's supposed to go to this guy's mom. They steal the heart. The son steals the heart back from the people in the black helicopters and goes on the run. So the president's people are trying to catch them to get the heart back. The president's political opponents' people are trying to make sure that they get away with it so that the president doesn't get the heart. And at one point it dawned on me, well, why can't the president just get an artificial heart? That the whole thing falls apart if there's an alternative. So I go to my transplant consultant, and say, well, what do I do? He says, oh, easy. He's on blood thinners, and you can't be on blood thinners and have an artificial heart. You'll just bleed to death.
Oh.
Problem solved. So,
interesting.
So it's just, and that's just weird stuff like that comes up. And because I could have simply ignored and never raised the issue of artificial heart, but as I'm writing it, I'm thinking somebody's going to catch me. And I can't leave a potential solution just ignored. You got to deal with it.
Right.
So, and so things like that happen a lot. But, and it's only because I wouldn't have known that. I mean, as much of research as I've done on these things, that never would have come up. So asking experts who already know this stuff, right, is just, you got to have some good experts in your phone list.
Yeah. In spite of how dark the subject matter is, the amount of times I laughed throughout the play kind of took me by surprise. How do you feel that comedy factors in when dealing with stories that have this much gravity and impact, and potentially people who have gone through this process themselves that may encounter some of these same issues?
Well, I think the more serious something is, people get why you can get the giggles at a funeral and not stop laughing. Serious stuff makes us nervous, but there's something about the human condition that underlies all that serious stuff. And somebody makes the right little crack and,
Yep.
we shouldn't be, he's dead, and so serious issues lend themselves to having the balloon popped.
Right.
There's something underlying it, and it doesn't undermine the seriousness of the issue. It sort of points out, we're so nervous about this, we're going to laugh.
So it emphasizes and underlines it, you mean?
Right. Yeah. It points it out without standing on the soapbox and pointing it out.
Right.
Right. Because nobody wants to hear me. And I wrote stuff like that. It's like, well, you're just on the soapbox there. It's like, you're right. It's not funny. I'm correct in what I'm saying, but it's not entertaining.
Right.
And so people tune out, and you try to find ways to make it entertaining.
So when audiences come to see a show like this, do you want them to leaving with more information than they came in with, but in a way that I guess the comedy will help them remember?
Right. Yeah. I mean, raise the questions. And I think the question about altruism, are there limits? Not something that normally comes up in the course of your, daily conversations, but this was a great way to explore that.
Right.
And there are, one of the thousands of articles I have was in the New Yorker 15 years ago. Gosh, my little puppy's crazy. When people would volunteer to donate a kidney to a stranger, a lot of doctors recoil. It's like, there's something pathologically wrong with you if you want to do that. It's just, and so they have to go through extensive psychological evaluation. They don't just say, oh, great, yeah, another kidney, come on. I think they've gotten less suspicious about people who do it. But I mean, that's a crazy thing. To say, I don't know, I know somebody needs it. I don't know who they are. It's one thing if it's a sibling or a spouse. There's a connection and more logic to why you would make a sacrifice like that. When it's a complete stranger, again, there's a whole group of medical ethicists who just think it's insane. I forget what the original question was.
Oh, no, you answered it pretty well. Yeah, I'm kind of floored by the balance that was struck in that. And here's where I'll get into a little bit of the questions behind this podcast. Now, this particular play, when I watched it, I came out of it feeling so conflicted about the relationship between physician-assisted suicide, questions of mental health, because at the onset of the play, the character is relatively of sound body, he's of sound mind, but he's ready to go and commit to this before he's really started the decline in health. And discussing the ethics behind it, discussing the bureaucracy behind it, felt like advocating on behalf of people who are on that donor list and people who are seeking to make that influence and make that change. In your experience, how does advocacy play into theater, into storytelling? Do you think there's a place for it? Do you think that there's a balance to be struck?
Well, I mean, any sort of storytelling allows you to explore subjects.
Right.
And so I find something that's not just interesting, it's life and death interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, the stakes are high. That's a good dramatic thing. And it seems like, so there's a balance between, I mean, there's some truth to the medical ethics notion of you're going to just exploit the poor,
Right.
you know, by, you know, offering money for their kidneys.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So if Bill Gates wanted to do it, that wouldn't be exploitation then, right? So he could do it. So let's explore. I didn't explore that, but it's a question. So the idea that selling your kidney is exploiting the poor means that at some level on the income range, it would not be exploitation for somebody to want to sell or give away a kidney.
Right.
That's interesting. Let's look at that. Why? So yeah, so that's you know, and that raises the whole question about the body as property.
Yes.
Which is more in Europe in the courts than it is here. But we have we like we do everything else, we creep slowly toward things. We don't suddenly say, okay, everybody can, you know, sell your blood cells and rent your womb and sperm and whatever, knock yourselves out. We slowly start. We allow it a little bit at a time.
Right.
And the court cases that I mentioned in the play are real court cases. Moore v. Regents, where a doctor treating somebody for leukemia took blood, developed a cell line, and made a fortune. Well, wait a minute, whose was that? You know, wasn't it the guy you took it from? Well,
Yeah.
no, you did the other work, you split it. Well, no, so they had a lawsuit about, you know, the money. And then there was the bone marrow thing. Used to be you could donate bone marrow, but you couldn't be compensated for the donation, because it wouldn't be a donation, you'd be selling it. But eventually the court decided, no, you can be compensated for doing this. So again, it's a little bit closer to who does all that stuff belong to?
Right.
You know, I like to think they're mine. And if it's mine, and the way Americans, property rights are sacrosanct in America. You can do a bunch of stuff, but don't mess with somebody's property or you'll be in court. So why aren't my parts my property? That's interesting.
Yeah.
Let's look at that. In Canada, they have begun to allow what the guy in my play is trying to do. People who are terminal are being allowed to have physician-assisted death by organ donation. So, you know, and in Europe, they're getting closer, just like they have been with physician-assisted death generally. Right. Than here in America. So I think all that stuff is again, because it's life and death, it's fascinating. And the people, the United Network for Organ Sharing, which is the single entity that controls all of this stuff in the US, it's like I explore that notion. It's like, well, you know, that's not very competitive. You know, if we're, you know, if the best results are usually determined by the marketplace, as they tell us frequently, maybe you have, you know, have some other system competing with these guys. And in fact, the One Legacy, which is the Southern California Organ Procurement Organization. So the UNOS is the overriding federal entity.
Right.
There are, I don't know, 8, 10, 12 regions geographic in the US, each of which has an organ procurement organization. And One Legacy is the name of the one in Los Angeles, in Southern California. And they were found themselves in front of a Senate Finance Committee late last year. And they were called out on the carpet for being so terrible. People are just dying because you're not doing this right, or, as well as, some of the other regions. Now, no one's doing that on purpose,
Right.
but I suspect there's, people have jobs that they're trying to protect, and there's liability issues they're trying to avoid, so that, and the result is, well, that those people just died because you don't want to get sued. And I understand not wanting to get sued, but if you got a system that's the result, well, let's take a look at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I mentioned earlier before we were in this podcast, the timing of all of this, because we had set up this podcast, I don't know, what was it, sometime last week.
Yeah.
And then just yesterday, John Oliver released a video about some of these same issues, which I hadn't thought about until seeing the Altruist. So it's interesting that more and more people are talking about this. Sorry, this is my cat. I'm going to move him real quick. He wants to be involved. It's just interesting, I think, that more and more people are starting to be aware of some of these issues, some of the red tape and logistical problems, and what the human cost is at the end of the day when these things aren't taken into account. There's no real system of tracking and making sure that it's well organized and well balanced. So people end up waiting for long periods of time. And looking at that through a comedic lens, it makes it something that you think about more readily, I think, or at least for me it was. So what is it particularly in your mind about satire and about comedy specifically that compels you as a writer? You've said that you struggle a little bit more with drama and don't really find the soapboxy method of more dramatic elements to hold an audience attention as well. So what about that compels you to write in a different way?
I think it's that it's the thing that I have developed, because I think I had a knack for being glib. And over time, as I wrote longer and longer form, I mean, I started writing radio commercials, so 30
Right.
seconds, 60 seconds, and then sketches, a minute, 2, 3, 4 minutes. Then I was writing sitcom specs, 30 minutes. Then I started writing feature scripts, 120 pages. And when nobody would buy one of those features that I knew was a really good story, okay, I guess I'll try it, or I'll write a novel. Never crossed my mind. But I've read novels. I know it's just words, it's information that you dole out in certain ways, and information about characters and information about the world they're in, and so forth. And I just became increasingly adept at knowing how to make a scene funny, make dialogue funny, because that's just the way I think. When I see a drama, trying to think of, I saw something called Red Dog Howling at a theater somewhere in North Hollywood years ago. I think it was the same producer who produced Pest Control as a musical, would produce this drama. And it was just like, I was just riveted by the dramatic stuff, the terrible circumstance someone found themselves in, and what the solution to that I couldn't have written that. I don't know how you do that. It doesn't cross my mind how to set that up and pay it off. I think in the same way that, and I've, a lot of the people I know who in the crime fiction community, it's like, how do you make that funny? How do you make yours serious? I don't know. What I've spent all my time trying to figure out how to do. And, I'm kind of adept at it. So that's just the best way. And it's a time-honored tradition of the way to deal with, serious human subjects, whether it's government, politics, ethical issues. So, it's Jonathan Swift recommending that we just eat the babies to solve the starvation problem and the overpopulation in Ireland. That's a little dark, but it's funny. And it didn't really solve the problem. And they're not gonna read my book or see this play and go, oh, let's go solve that problem now.
Yeah.
Because we hadn't thought of that, Bill. Like, people are thinking of, but another part of this, and we talked about this before the podcast, about the body parts thing. It's like, so some of the articles I have, like here's one of them.
Oh, wow.
So there, and
very dark.
Well, this play I was going to write. So there's I don't say. Oh, here's another good one.
Oh wow, selling and shipping human body parts. That's the title of one of the articles.
Right. These people find out that there's very little regulation, and we can go tell people who are, in dire financial straits, look, maybe you'd like to donate your loved one's body to science, and they sell it. It's all nice and sweet. And then they've got, they take them back to the warehouse and they've got a chainsaw. And they're shipping these parts out. The refrigeration's iffy, and then the loved ones come back and say, well, don't we get the remains? Oh yeah, and they hand them some a container that's got like chicken bones and cement powder.
Yep. It's not actually even their ashes.
Right. No. Yeah. And it's sort of like, so, what people are willing to do, to make a living, how low people will go is also, I love the low bumbling criminal types who just do just like, oh God, I can't believe you would do that. And they're out there doing it everywhere.
Yep.
And that's another very sort of Elmore Leonard. Elmore didn't deal with a lot of super white collar crime stuff. He's much more well known for knuckleheads in Detroit doing, creepy stuff. And, those people are interesting to me.
What is the challenge for a story like this? What's the challenge for taking it from a novel to a stage adaptation, specifically a musical?
Well, actually, this went the other way. I'd written all my novels, and then I had this idea, and I thought, well, it's got songs in it, so I can't make a novel. So I guess I'll learn how to write a play. And so I wrote it as a play. And the development it's changed a lot. The initial play ends with the judge about to make announce the verdict the bomber comes in, actually somebody just throws a grenade in through the window. It's a grenade. Boom, into play.
Oh, wow.
Which I know that's kind of fun. But in the course of developing it at group rep, I've been convinced, no, you need to, what happens next? So it's changed a lot.
Right.
So anyway, it was a play first, and then a publisher in London contacted me and said they wanted to republish my backlist. So I went around and got whatever rights I didn't have reverted yet, so they could republish everything. And then he said, "Oh, and by the way, are you writing a new one?" And so I lied and said, "Sure, of course I am. It's about this producer who shows up wanting to make a musical about this guy selling his organs." That's fantastic. So I just wrote it as a novel because somebody, said would buy that.
Mm-hmm.
So it went that way. And then doing rewrites since the novel version, which allowed me to develop characters far more than they were in the play, and add some other characters who aren't in the play. Now doing a rewrite, I'm bringing some of that stuff back to a new draft of the play.
So they feed into each other.
Yeah. You being allowed to figure out who the Leonard Gersh character, the producer, he just in the play, the versions you've seen, he just shows up. I've got this idea, and he starts singing his songs. And meanwhile, the other characters are pursuing the legal thing. Oh, here's another song.
Yeah.
And he didn't. The best note that I got from the last two-nighter we did was to point out that Leonard really doesn't have an arc. He shows up, he just does his thing, and nothing gets in the way, nothing changes. In the course of writing the novel, and this isn't exactly how he's changing in the new play, but in the novel, it turns out he had stolen some money from a guy who was giving him money to produce a play. Things weren't working out, so Leonard just skedaddles with the $10,000. And for the rest of the story, that guy periodically gets closer and closer and closer to finding Leonard, which he does in the end. And then we find out that Leonard's walking cane is also a gun.
Oh.
So he shoots the guy. Anyway, but so I in the new draft that I just sent over to Bruce Kimmel, Leonard has more of an arc. He says he's this person, and it's later revealed he's not exactly who he says he was, and he's got to beg forgiveness and show humility and do something other than being the bragging, the impresario big shot that he's been saying he is. Mm-hmm. And so he bonds more with the characters because he's had to show some humanity, which
right.
The previous drafts, he's just been not exactly a force of nature, but nothing's really slowed down his progress.
Right.
So, yeah.
Do you have just next on the horizon, do you have anything else in this vein, or are you steering now, you're writing in a new direction?
Like a new play or a new version of the old one?
Are you writing any new plays or new novels? And what has captured your interest most recently?
Well, I almost did the story, or started, in fact, I did start it. I have a file here called Heads Will Roll, because one of the body parts stories in the news was about a mother and daughter who were running one of these horrible outfits somewhere in Colorado with a warehouse full of parts that were rotting and all this terrible stuff. And I thought, well, it's a mother and daughter who've had conflict over something, figure that out. and the daughter comes back home after leaving. Dad has died. The will is read. They're expecting something to come their way, and turns out all that's coming their way is a big load of debt. Dad is, wasn't who he said he was. And then the funeral guy wants a bunch of money for the funeral, and they find out about the body parts thing. And they decide, well, why let them make all the money? Let's us go into business. So mom and daughter have had conflict, and then they bond over running this horrible business of body parts. So mom comes in with a butcher's outfit, blood everywhere. It's like, hey, we got to get those shoulders out to Denver tomorrow,
Yeah.
And so I thought about doing that, but then I thought, I just did an organ thing. Everybody's going to think that's all I got. So actually, I'm writing a different play that's just some knucklehead criminals. There are body parts involved, but it's nothing to do with transplants. It's fun. It was a short story I wrote for this book.
Die Behind the Wheel.
And so stories inspired by the songs of Steely Dan.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wrote a short story called Green Earrings, and I thought, hey, that might be a play. So that's what I'm working.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to keeping up with the progress on the Altruist, and looking forward to the new stories that you write. I just wanted to end this with just a thank you for coming onto the podcast and sharing your story. You've been a wonderful guest, and a lot of information that I'm sure people are still gleaning as things come to light about the organ donation industry. Thank you very much, and I will see you next time, and I hope everyone enjoyed the podcast.
Thanks, Kat.